Good afternoon, and welcome to the Met. My name is Joseph Scheier-Dolberg, and I'm Assistant Curator of Chinese Painting and Calligraphy here at the Met. And I am curator of the exhibition that you see a gallery shot of here, Out of Character, Decoding Chinese Calligraphy, selections from the collection of Akiko, Yamazaki, and Jerry Yang. This is on view in the galleries for Chinese Painting and Calligraphy now, and it is the exhibition that this Friday Focus Lecture is being held in conjunction with. I'm thrilled and honored to have the opportunity this afternoon to welcome our distinguished speaker, Professor Robert Harrist, the Jane and Leopold Swergold Professor of Chinese Art History at Columbia University. In his extraordinarily productive career, Professor Harrist has authored important books on the Song Dynasty artist Li Gonglin, on Chinese gardens, on Chinese calligraphy, on contemporary art, and much, much more. And I just want to single out one of those publications by name, his most recent book on Chinese art, The Landscape of Words, Stone Inscriptions from Early and Medieval China. It's fantastic, but you don't have to take my word for it. It was given the Joseph Levinson Prize by the Association of Asian Studies in 2010 for the most distinguished publication on Chinese history pre-1900 in that year. Most recently, he has curated an exhibition of paintings by the American artist Roy Newell that opened May 1st at the Pollock Krasner House in Long Island. It's also accompanied by a really beautiful and beautifully written catalog, and it will be on view through the end of July. Now, for our purposes today, what is perhaps more important than any of those accomplishments is the fact that Professor Harrist has been, for a couple decades now, one of the most lucid and engaging teachers of the history of Chinese calligraphy, working in any place and in any language. His passion for this art and his ability to identify and explain how it works is truly unique. And I know this firsthand because he is my doctoral advisor and a mentor and a dear friend. I'm thrilled that he's here today to share his talk that he's called Reading and Looking, the Pleasures of Chinese Calligraphy. So please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Harrist.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe. It's a very kind introduction, and many congratulations on the show. It just looks great, and it's exciting to get to be at the Met this afternoon to talk about it. Joe has worked out this wonderful pedagogical introduction to the show. You'll see video displays. They're very helpful handouts you can take with you into the galleries. And I think it's good to just dive right in. The range of calligraphy on view is astonishing. And you have to take your time. And I think as you do, you will discover in this exhibition that many different kinds of pleasure can be derived from looking at these marvelous works. Pleasures of various sorts. But they're all pleasures that require slow looking and, in some cases, reading. Now, I want to look at quite a few things this afternoon, so we can't go too slowly. But I'd like to start with the flagship work of the exhibition, perhaps, this big scroll that you see when you come in. And let's just spend a little time with this now. It's a very big hanging scroll by a 17th century artist named Mi Wanzhong. It's about 10 feet high. I'm 5'10", so you can get a sense. It just goes on up and up. And it's a transcription of a poem from the Tang Dynasty from the 9th century, a poem describing the court of the emperor in extremely grand or even grandiose language. Now, I'll read it to you in Chinese, if you don't mind listening to Chinese with a Texas accent. And it says this, 经典当头景阁重，仙人掌上玉芙蓉，太平天子乔元日，五色云车驾六龙. Which means roughly this, the golden palaces above him by the storied purple pavilion, on the immortal hand, there is a jade hibiscus. The Prince of Heaven, the Son of Heaven of the Great Peace, greets the New Year's Day morning, while a 5-colored cloud chariot is driven with 6 dragons. It evokes this fantastic vision of the Tang Dynasty court. Just as a piece of poetry, it's a very common type of Chinese poetic writing. It's a quatrain, 4 lines, and each line is 7 characters. And the rhythm is dun dun, dun dun, dun dun dun. 经典当头子个穷, and it rhymes on 穷, 荣, and then the final character, 龙. Now, reading the poem is fun, but for the most part, the greatest pleasure lies in looking at this as a work of calligraphy, as a display of beautiful brushwork. And I think most Chinese connoisseurs would say the text is not terribly important. It's the way the characters are written that is the real source of pleasure and beauty. So how do you begin talking about what you see? Well, the writing began in the upper right, and the calligrapher continued down to the end of this column. Now, because this paper is so big, it had to be written on a writing table with Mi Wanzhong leaning over to write like this, while probably 2 little servant boys moved the paper for him. He didn't go up and down writing on it. The paper came to him, as it were. So when he got to the bottom, the servants had to move the paper back up to the top, and he started again, and the process was repeated. Now, this is in a script type that we'll talk about more later called cursive script. It's the most fluid, the most abbreviated, the most rapidly written of the basic types of Chinese writing. And in many cases, 2 or more characters are linked together in a single gesture. This is actually 2 characters, 子个, purple pavilions. And you can follow the motion of Mi Wanzhong's brush. He used a brush pretty much like this one that I just happened to bring along to use as a pointer, beginning up here and then going across, and then starting again at the top. And notice how the stroke goes down and wraps over itself and then comes around and does it again. The writing is flat, but there's something about the way the strokes overlap that creates a 3-dimensional effect. There is depth in the writing. You can also see something happening here that's extraordinarily interesting and is clearly an aesthetic effect that he liked. The brush is going dry, and he has to really push there. He lifts up here, then pushes down again. See this area, and then at the end, the hairs of the brush are separating because the ink is leaving the hairs of the brush, and the ink doesn't cover the surface uniformly. Following these inflections in the brushwork, you get a sense of the time of the writing. He wrote this character, and look how the brush was going dry. What he surely did at this point was stop, move his brush over, dip it in the ink, and begin again with a nice jet black stroke, beginning this character, Zhang. He writes generally with this very broad, sort of generous open motion, using his whole arm. This is big-scale calligraphy. The brush works kind of like a seismograph. It picks up every inflection from your body, your arm, your wrist, the tips of your fingers, and transmits it to the writing surface. Now, in looking at this calligraphy and beginning to talk about it, beginning to appreciate it together, one is really joining a tradition that goes back a long, long way in China. Calligraphy is really the supreme art of traditional China. It's the art that was appreciated above all others, and it was an art that was particularly important in the lives of upper-class, educated people like these gentlemen whom you see gathered in a garden from a Song Dynasty painting of the 12th century. What do you do at a garden party? Well, you drink wine, of course, but you also watch someone write. The focus of the painting is this gentleman, and he's using a writing brush like this one to write a scroll. Maybe he's composing a poem on the spot on the occasion of this garden party, while everybody looks on. The experience of watching someone write is something that's still a very important part of Chinese culture today. For example, here is a group a few years ago in Beijing watching a calligrapher write two nice big characters. I note with pleasure that Professor Goldberg, a great expert on calligraphy, is here today. Every literate person who learns how to write with this kind of brush and with ink has a kind of performative insight into calligraphy that people of all sorts from all walks of life share. Whether it's the school kids in Taiwan carefully transcribing characters, or Chairman Mao writing his calligraphy, they have a kind of shared knowledge of what it's like to produce calligraphy that then, I think, helps shape the way that they respond to calligraphy. Everyone who learns to use the brush has this kind of performative insight. It's kind of like if you go to the ballet with a dancer and sit next to them, they sort of respond to it in a special way because they can do it themselves. Now, for most of us, as is often noted, handwriting is kind of a lost art. We're always texting and tweeting and twittering and blogging and emailing, and one can go maybe for days at a time without really putting pen to paper. And just a couple of days ago, I saw this article on the BBC website. I guess this makes it official. Is a signature still useful? The article is an account of the general decline of handwriting and raises the question, do we really even need to learn how to write anymore since everything is done electronically? I think for myself, I can spend a lot of time sitting at a computer typing, and handwriting isn't a big part of my life anymore. But I think even for those of us who don't write beautifully with traditional tools, there's still a kind of sensitivity to handwriting, to typographic fonts, and to lettering of all kind that we're very alert to just walking down the street. Oops, I lost my earpiece here. For example, if you just wander around my neighborhood, the Upper West Side, you'll find an amazing variety of shop signs. And I find that each one of them, just through the quality of the writing, conveys a slightly different impression of the businesses. I mean, take Murray Sturgeon. It always seems to me that Murray sells his sturgeon with a kind of flair that the more restrained Linny doesn't bring to his bagels. And it's very hard to say just why it is. But if you pass by Fancy Care Cleaners, there's something about the way those two words are written that suggests fancy care really is. Or Metro Diner, which has this nice sort of Art Deco look of a 20s or 30s establishment. Actually, I think it opened about 10, 15 years ago on Upper Broadway. But the lettering suggests historically associations with the past. Beyond street signs, these days, just playing around with your computer, you can experiment with all kinds of effects typographically that illustrate how sensitive we are to this sort of thing. For example, when you see this sign, I find it really means business. But why is it when you look at this? Now, seriously, ask yourself, why are you laughing? It's hard to explain, but there is something about the disconnect between the message and this extremely elegant sort of wedding announcement script that produces a comic effect. Or you can play around with your concept of the identity of the Met typographically. I think this is pretty close to the official Met font that projects an impression of the institution, this wonderful place we all love. If you change the font to this, it's something different. Maybe it suggests they'd use it up at the cloisters. It also struck me, looking at this, it's as if the New York Times and the Metropolitan Museum of Art merged, you could have writing like this. And we respond to this without really being able to explain exactly why. This suggests maybe a dinner in the trustees' dining room. While this, it suggests something almost sultry to me. Maybe having a drink before the Costume Institute ball. I'm inclined to sort of read this with the French accent for some reason. Or the Met as a Saturday morning, kid-friendly kind of place. All of these are messages conveyed solely by the script, by the way these words are written. But it's not limited to things that we can read. For example, it seems to me that Zamushkevich up there is a rather different thing from Zamushkevich here, and then again different there. I have no idea what this word means since I just made it up. But you see, even when you don't know the linguistic, the semantic content, script matters. Now, if you bring some of this intuition to Chinese, even if you can't read the language, or if, like me, you only read it with some difficulty, you intuit certain things. For example, if you know that one of these pieces of calligraphy is a kind of crazy drunken monk's autobiographic statement, and the other is an inscription intended to be carved on stone documenting the history of a Buddhist temple, you kind of figure it out. This is the mad monk, and here is Zhao Mengfu's inscription for the Miaoyan Si in his hometown of Wuxing. What if I tell you this, or ask you this? Where is the title of this stele inscription reproduced in a rubbing? Where is the title? Most people figure out it's those big characters at the top. And you know that not because you can read it, but you just sort of understand that big and isolated and, in this case, actually in an old-fashioned script type, is important and probably is the title of the stele. And here, one of the scrolls in the exhibition, this is one of a pair of hanging scrolls written in clerical script. But if you know that on this scroll is also the signature of the calligrapher, where is it? It's over here, the small characters to the side. Whether these are universal conventions of script or typography, I'm not sure, but there's a lot that one intuits at a pre-linguistic, at a pre-semantic level, looking at calligraphy. Now, as I said, you can derive great pleasure from Chinese calligraphy without going out and taking 5 years of Chinese language courses to learn how to read. It would be nice if you want to. But I think in approaching calligraphy, it is nice to know a little bit about the nature of Chinese writing. And one often sees in textbooks charts like this that illustrate something of which you're almost certainly already aware, and that is the script originated in pictographic form. In other words, the character for mountain looks like a mountain, and then the script is gradually simplified and stylized, and here's the modern form of the character over here. This is the character for field, and well, it looks like a field, and simplified to this, a door, the moon, and so on. It's important to understand, of course, that almost immediately as the script was being invented, it was simplified and stylized. It's not just a bunch of little pictures. If it were, you wouldn't need to take Chinese. You could just read it by looking. You don't have to be too advanced in sinology to recognize the character for the word yu, or fish. This is a rubbing from a bronze inscription around the year 1000 BCE. And about 500 years later, the script had changed quite a bit. You might find it, but maybe not. There's the fish character now, and you can see how it's become more abstract, more regular. It's lost much of its fishy appearance. even though the characters lose this pictographic aspect, there are traces of the pictorial structure that endure in the characters. And it's probably this that gives them a kind of secret animation and life that other forms of writing lack. Here are several versions of the fish character. Here, the head and fins or tail have just been reduced to a hook stroke and some dots, and then the character can be abbreviated like that. But still, something of the original structure endures. Now, the most interesting thing is not that these were pictures. It's what the scribes about 1200 BCE did with these pictures that's important. And it's key to keep in mind that speaking came first. It's surprising how hard it is to define what writing really is. If we use as a rough and ready definition the graphic representation of speech, well, that will have to do. People spoke, and then they wanted to write down what they were saying. So how did they do it? Well, if you just draw little pictures to represent words, you run out of things that you can represent really fast. What do you do next? Let's look at the history of just one character. This is a scroll in the show, and the third character is this, a very, very common character in Chinese. Lai means to come or to come to some place. Now, in the old days, in its earliest form, this character was written like that. It's a representation of a growing plant or weed. It sort of looks like a corn stalk. So what's cornstalk or a plant got to do with the verb to come? This is some of the earliest writing known. It's from an oracle bone inscription used for communication with the spirits about 1200 BCE. And there, circled in red, is our character. It actually appears several times in this inscription. And in every place that it appears, scholars have been able to work out what it's really saying is there will be the coming of trouble. The king is worried about the future. So what does coming have to do with this growing plant? The key is this. The two words were pronounced the same way. In modern Chinese, this is pronounced lai. And through the amazing efforts of sinologists, archaeologists, epigraphers, students of history of linguistics, it's possible to show that what the scribes began to do was this. When they wanted to write a word that's more abstract, that's harder to represent as a little picture, they used phonetic substitutions. And you just had to understand that here, it doesn't mean a weed or plant. It's standing in phonetically for a word with the same sound. Now, this system works in a very interesting way in Chinese because there are lots of homophones. There are lots of words that have different meaning, but are pronounced the same way. For example, there's a word called tong that means harmony or unity, things brought together. There's another word pronounced just the same way, tong, that means bronze. Tong is also a species of tree. I think it's a linseed tree. And then there's a word tong, third tone, scooping tone, in Mandarin Chinese that means tube or pipe. So let's start and invent, as the scribes did, a word for harmony. It looks like this. Now, for sinologists, you can check Karlgren and Murahashi, and you'll discover that this is interpreted as a pictographic representation, not of a mouth, as we often thought, but of something being covered, the idea of bringing together something and covering something else. This is maybe a debatable point, but let's say we've got this character. So what do we do for bronze, linseed tree, and the pipe? Well, we'll just use phonetic substitution. What's the problem with this? It gets really confusing. And the scribes almost immediately came up with a solution way back in the Shang dynasty. To write the word for bronze, which is pronounced tong, let's take the tong character, bring it down here, and we'll add another element. This element is an independent character that means metal. You look at this character and you realize, oh, it's pronounced tong, and it probably has something to do with metal. It probably is the word for bronze. What about the tree? Well, this is a signifier for all things to do with trees and wood. And for the tube, the pipe, those things were made out of bamboo in the old days. This is a signifier for everything to do with bamboo. The system is brilliant. It's pronounced tong, has something to do with metal, it must be bronze. It's pronounced tong, has something to do with wood, it must be the linseed tree, and so on. About 80% of Chinese characters work this way. It's a system based on phonetic substitutions with these signifiers that indicate broad categories of meaning, so you don't end up with complete confusion, which you would get if you wrote phonetically. This system also works brilliantly for Chinese because in Chinese there are no conjugations, there are no declensions, there are not the complex transformations of verb forms that we have to learn in Western languages. I always tell people, yes, it's somewhat laborious to learn Chinese, but not having to learn the imperfect subjunctive makes up for a lot. Now, after that little excursion into sinology and the nature of the script, let's go back in the galleries. I mean, that's what it's really all about. And come back to this scroll, which I like very, very much. You'll see it several times. I think that with this scroll, as I'm now inclined to say, with every work of art, perhaps the most interesting thing about it is how it was made. I tell the students this a lot. You can never, ever go wrong understanding how something was made. Now, this scroll was made using brush and ink. It's kind of a messy image, but I think it's sort of authentic in representing what a calligrapher's desk would be like. This is an ink stick. It's got a kind of ornamental decoration on it, but it's simply pine soot mixed with glue into this hard cake or stick that is ground with water on this stone to produce this basic fluid of Chinese writing. And here are the brushes. These are little accoutrements for water, and there's a seal later to be affixed to the calligraphy. This is the basic stuff used to make the big scroll. All important are the brushes. They come in various sizes. Here is an assortment of them. You can see with this brush, when it's dry, the hairs separate. But when you dip it in ink, the hairs come together to this extremely flexible, fluid point. Brushes are made out of animal hair. Wolf hair, goat hair in particular is popular. These brushes haven't yet been used. They have to be loosened up and broken in. But once they're ready, the writing can begin. Now, in the exhibition, you will learn a lot about the basic scripts of Chinese calligraphy. These are rather parallel to font types. And the show is set up in such a way that there is this wonderful explanatory material and a demonstration with a video outside the galleries. And you'll learn about seal script, clerical, cursive, semi-cursive, and standard. Just being able to recognize these, I think, is also a great pleasure when you go through the show, because you gain the ability to give a name to something, to identify something. And I think this is very satisfying. I mean, if you go bird watching, and you say, oh, it's a red bird over there, and there's a little blue bird over there, it's when you know the names of the birds that you're really bird watching. And I think when you can identify scripts, you've begun to see things in calligraphy that I don't think you would necessarily grasp without the way the show is set up. Seal script is the earliest form of writing that you'll see in the show. All of these script types were developed a long, long time ago, but they never completely go out of style. This is a duilian, a pair of scrolls that would be hung together. They're from the 18th century, written, or is this 19th? This is it's early 19th. It is a couplet, two lines, and he chose to write it in this old-fashioned script type. Now, seal script is a script type that still has some hint of the old pictographic elements of writing. The characters are sort of wiggly and fluid. It's a script type written by holding the brush absolutely upright like this, letting the ink flow evenly on both sides of the brush tip to produce these generally unmodulated lines. They don't thicken, they don't thin. It's a hard script to write. It takes immense control to write in this manner. It's called seal script for what becomes an obvious reason. This is the form of script used for the seals or chops that you'll see stamped on calligraphies throughout the exhibition. This is a big 18th century seal of the Manchu Emperor. And you can see the basic character of the writing is still that of these even, unmodulated, fluid lines, though here produced through carving rather than writing with a brush and impressed with red seal paste on paper. This is clerical script. This is the way people were writing roughly around the time of Christ. It's a simplification of seal script, and it's somewhat easier and faster to write. The characters are blockier. They're rather squat rather than elongated vertically. Forms are more regular and more angular, and you begin seeing in clerical script traces of what the brush can do so beautifully, and that is to produce a line that starts with one dimension and then pushing gets thicker and ends. There is a flare at the end of this stroke and over here that's characteristic of this script type. If you put the seal script character yo, to have, next to the same character written in the clerical script, which developed, as I said, a little bit later, you can see everything is squared off, more boxier, more regular. There are just more strokes in this form of writing. It's called clerical script for the following reason. It's particularly associated with the bureaucracy of the Han Dynasty when this script type developed, and it was used by clerks or officials who really carry out the administration of the Han Empire by writing things down. In the old days, the Chinese wrote down everything. And we have immense quantities of wooden and bamboo slips that are essentially bureaucratic records from the Han period written in the script type. It's easier. I mean, it's a drag to draw these little pictures over and over again. If you're a poor clerk having to write letters and government documents day after day, there's greater efficiency, there's greater speed, there's greater ease in writing in this form. And around the same time, cursive script also developed. Here's the Miwanzhong scroll that I spent some time with earlier. In this script type, characters that in block script that we'll see in a minute would be written like this, Jin, Din, Dong, To, can turn into one gesture through simplification and linkage of strokes. You can go from top to bottom with scarcely needing to lift your brush. It's a rapid form of writing, and it's also considered the most expressive. There's an old saying in Chinese, 字如其人, the writing is like the man, or like the person. And in cursive script in particular, it's traditionally believed that everything about your personality, your formation, your education, your character would pour out seismographically into your writing. Here's another beautiful linkage with some of the dry brush work. Semi-cursive or running script, well, it's kind of scribbly, but not as scribbly as full cursive script. Characters are abbreviated, but generally they're not links between strokes. You'll see some beautiful examples of this from the Ming Dynasty in the show, including this piece and some others by a wonderful, very famous artist named Wen Zhengming. Take time to look at a beautiful large character scroll he wrote when he was 84 years old. The script type that you would learn today if you take Chinese 101 or if you're a school kid in China is this. It's called standard script, 楷书 in Chinese. It's a form of writing that's the most legible. It's what all of us who study the language learn first, and most of us feel most comfortable reading this. But it's not easy to write. If you look closely at the way these characters are formed, there's so many stops and starts. There are so many very precise articulations of corners, thickening and thinning of strokes. Generally speaking, in looking at calligraphy, it's always interesting to look at corners. How are they made? To write this character, which is zhong, which means middle, as in Zhongguo, China, there's a stroke here, lift, another stroke here, stop. Now, how do you make this big shoulder? You start again, press down and come down, and then a thinner stroke across, and then one long tapering stroke, lift, 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 lift. It gets thin, and you're lifting the brush from the writing surface. Here are some details of characters in this script type. You can see that even the dots are not just little dots. Each one has its own silhouette. Each one sort of has its own personality. Thickening and thinning takes place very quickly. Put the brush down, lift, and then push, and the character there is done. It's sometimes a little confusing to tell the difference between clerical script and standard script. But if you put them next to each other, you can begin to see that clerical script is generally kind of blockier, a little squatter, a little dumpier compared to kaishu. There aren't as many inflections in the brushwork. There are not as many rapid changes from thick to thin. The corners are simpler. You just go across and down, and then you're done. Whereas look at the shoulder up at the top. Oh, I can point. Look at that. I mean, this is an amazing detail, but it's key to beautiful standard script writing. Here are all the script types for review. I reorganized Joe's scheme a little bit so that you go from seal to clerical and then standard script here. These are sort of the most legible. Running script, and then wild cursive, in which the character is radically abbreviated, and you really have to be an expert to read this. Now, once you know your script types, and you can begin to identify them, and you have the pleasure of being able to talk in a preliminary way about what you're seeing, where do you go next? How do you look at calligraphy? Or, to put it another way, how do you describe calligraphy? Describing is really a form of seeing, I think. And in describing, you see more. And the weird thing, of course, about looking at the visual arts is you perceive it all at once. There's no structure or order into which you're perceiving things. But the only way you can talk about it is in language, which has to unfold sequentially in time. So I'd propose some ways you can begin talking about it, and it's a rather artificial system, but at least it's a way to get going. So I think the first thing you can notice, and the first thing you could talk about, is simply how characters are laid out on the writing surface. In this case, they're organized in a grid. There is actually a grid, a bunch of little squares, written in fine lines on the paper. The characters are organized in very beautifully regulated columns and absolutely even rows going across from left to right. You start at the top here. That's the title of this famous literary piece, Read Down, Top, Down, and so on. This contrasts radically with other types of calligraphy in which the sense of the layout is much, much freer. In these poems by a calligrapher named Wang Do, there's still columns. You still start at the top but go down. But notice how he lets the columns drift. He's not too worried about maintaining a kind of vertical spine going from top to bottom. And as far as the rows, the horizontal alignment, it's really not an issue. The calligraphy spreads across the page freely. The layout of characters can be very dense, as on this fan by the famous painter and calligrapher Scheier-Dolberg. There's scarcely any room left on the writing surface. Or writing can be very spacious and open. There can be lots of room between the characters, as if air can circulate amongst them. These are all things that I think one can notice. Now, after thinking about the overall layout of a piece of calligraphy, you can attend to the structure of the individual characters. Let's work with standard script. It's a little bit easier to describe. Now, when you're learning to write calligraphy, you're often given gridded sheets like this to help you get your bearings. And to write even the simplest character, like this one, ren, man, it's just 1, 2 strokes. But structurally, you've got to get it just right. 1, 2. If you put 2 too far down, the character will look kind of boring. If you put it up too high, that will look very uncomfortable too. There's a kind of inner architecture in each character that has to be done just right if it's going to be beautiful. This is the character shang, which means above or to go up. Where you place this dot is critical. Too high, and it will look as if the structure here is weak. Too low, and it looks dumpy. Notice how this stroke is not a line, but it's a trajectory. It has an arc. It bends up. The calligrapher came across and then ended with this rounded tip that finishes the character. This is a hard character to write. It's zu, which means to walk, or it can mean foot. And it's all about balancing this box on top of the character, of this stroke. It's shifted a little bit to this side. If it was right in the center, it would look kind of boring. This has to be just the right length to support everything that's above. Or this character, hua, which means flower. In this character, this is the phonetic part. It tells you how it's pronounced. This is a radical or signifier of broad category of meaning that has to do with plants. Everything with that at the top has something to do with some floral subject. If you put these strokes too high, it looks as if they're drifting off into space. Too low, and they'll hit below. When writing standard script, people generally like to warm up, practicing the individual strokes separately first. This character is called Yong. It means eternity, and it's a very popular character for practicing because you've got all the basic strokes of standard script in it. The dot, the shoe stroke going down with a little go, kick to the side, the T stroke over here goes up, wan, pie, and na. Put them together in the right order and you have yung. And the order in which they're written is critical. Every good teacher of Chinese enforces with the utmost severity correct stroke order. That is, you have to begin with the dot on top, then you go across and then go down. Do it wrong and you might get a slap on the wrist. And you follow the motion in the individual strokes when you look closely at a stroke like this in the character zhi. Look how this begins heavy, then arcs and gets lighter, thinner, and then a great crescendo, and then pull up, and it's done. These are the dots that I showed you earlier. Each one of them has a kind of personality. Each one has a kind of separate identity. But how they're all put together, look at all these dots flying every which way. Move them a little bit one way or the other, and the character would fall apart. Now, it's important to keep in mind that script type is not really the same thing as style. Personal style can vary greatly within the same category of script. These are rubbings of characters carved on stone, written by two very famous Tang Dynasty calligraphers in the 7th and 8th century. Both beautiful classic examples of standard script. But over here, Chu Suiliang, the calligrapher, tends to write with lighter, thinner lines. He makes big shoulders, but they look much softer than the immense bony shoulders of characters like this, written by Yan Zhengqing, who stresses also the thick vertical and thin horizontal, while Chu Suiliang tends to even out the width of the strokes. Here are two examples of clerical, one rather heavier, thicker, one with more fluctuation in the brushwork, this by Wenpeng, a beautiful example out in the show. Both of these categorized as clerical script, but the two calligraphers bring different sensibilities, different approaches to shaping the individual strokes, while still maintaining the basic structure of the script type. And in cursive script, it's all over the place. This is Mi Wanzhong. And if you walk around behind this scroll in the gallery, you'll see this amazing scroll by Wang Duo, also in cursive script. But these are two radically different artistic personalities who have essential ways of moving the brush that are very, very different. Essentially, Mi Wanzhong moves in broad, round motions, whereas Wang Duo tends to favor this sort of nervous, back and forth, jagged, horizontal movement. Curves or hooks are very distinctive. Mi Wanzhong's tend to have a wide turning radius, shall we say, whereas the hooks in Wang Duo are sharp and angular. There is a more compressed effect in his writing. Both of these are magnificent examples of the same script type, cursive. Wang Duo also produces wonderful effects with the brush going dry. Comes down here and finishes, reloads the brush, and then produces this kind of blurred character on satin. This is a fabric for writing that you'll see used often in the show that absorbs ink, sometimes in this sort of blurry way, but it's clearly an effect that the calligraphers and viewers liked. Now, I've been going on and on about the brushwork and the shapes of the characters and the structure and so on. This isn't exactly the way that people talked about calligraphy in the old days. And in the show, there's a magnificent example of what you might call the discourse, to use a fancy word, the criticism of calligraphy in the form of multiple hanging scrolls. There are 12 altogether. I couldn't get them all on the screen, by a late Ming artist named Zhang Reitu. What he's done is to transcribe a 6th century text on calligraphy. And if you read closely, much of this has been translated, you'll find that he talks about calligraphy, or the 6th century writer Yuan'ang talks about calligraphy through a system of metaphors. He doesn't talk about this stroke, that stroke, structure, and so on. He talks about calligraphy through what is essentially poetic language. Here are a few examples. He says, the calligraphy of recluse Tao is like a youth from the Wuxing region, although not yet fully formed as an adult, nevertheless powerful and agile of body. The calligrapher of Yuanzong is like a Taoist hermit deep in the mountains. As soon as he sees someone, he wants to withdraw even further. The calligraphy of Sojing is like a brisk wind suddenly rising, or a bird of prey abruptly soaring. The calligraphy of Meng Yuanlu is like a collapsing cliff. When people see it, they're struck with awe. The calligraphy of Zhongguo is like a flying goose playing over the sea, a dancing crane roaming in the heavens. The calligraphy of Xiao Sihua is like a dragon leaping at the gate of heaven, like a tiger crouching at the Phoenix Pavilion. Remember that movie a few years ago? There's a crouching. A lot of the language calligraphy criticism is related to the language of martial arts. And you'll notice a recurring taste for metaphors based on kinetic force, movement, and action. Now, I want to show you something. Like nearly everything else, calligraphy is being studied by the neuroscientists who do brain scans like this. There's nothing sillier than an art historian trying to be scientific. Unless it's a scientist trying to be arty. We have to cooperate. But at the State Neuroscience Lab at Hong Kong University, Dr. Tan Lihai and his colleagues have been doing work like this. And what these brain scans show, A, are people reading Chinese, B, the same people reading English. And this C, the red is unique to Chinese and the blue unique to brain response to reading English. What Dr. Tan has argued, and I think this is becoming accepted, is this. When people read Chinese, as when they read English, some area of the brain that deals with language processing is activated. But what's different in the reading of Chinese is cross-activation of that part of the brain that controls motor functions. And his theory is this. When you learn Chinese, learning to write and learning the stroke order is so essential to how the language is imprinted in your brain. It continues to be operative when you're reading Chinese, even if you're not moving your hands. And I think this is a very interesting finding in light of what you just saw in the traditional metaphoric language of talking about Chinese that's so animated with metaphors of force, movement, speed. Often when you go into galleries, you see Chinese readers doing this in the air when they're reading scrolls. In part, they're deciphering, but they're also re-experiencing this motor phenomenon. Again, I can't possibly be thought of as qualified to discuss this, but I thought I would just make you aware of this work. You can Google it up. Now, it's true. Pleasure comes from looking, but it also comes from reading. This gentleman is reading an inscription on a mountain in China. Often, the text that calligraphers choose to write are famous pieces of literature that educated people know by heart. In the show by the Ming Dynasty calligrapher Wang Chung, there's a transcription of a beloved prose poem from the Song Dynasty by Su Dongpo, the first prose poem on the Red Cliff. And it's a wonderful account of Su Dongpo's outing with some friends to a historic site. Often, even to this day, when you talk to calligraphers, they'll say, well, I just grabbed something to write. I'm not too worried about the text. I'm not too worried about reading it. But the fact is, once literacy takes hold, you can't turn it off. And this is something that you may have read about in Psychology 101. There exists something called the Stroop interference effect. And this is something developed by Professor Stroop some years ago. He did an experiment that goes like this. If you're shown these blocks of color and asked to simply name the color, most people don't have any trouble saying red, green, blue, yellow. Fine. Now, he shows you another slide, and he just wants you to name the colors of the writing. Now try to do it. You see what happens? Something gets in the way. You can't turn it off. And it works in Chinese as well. So yes, we read calligraphy to the extent that we can, those of us who struggle with the language. And I think it's this compulsion to read that is the secret to the magnificent effect of Xu Bing's book From the Sky, which was on view here at the Met just a month or so ago. As I think most of you know, this very, very famous work by, in my opinion, one of the greatest living artists anywhere, Xu Bing, fills a gallery with printed text in books and on scrolls hanging from the ceiling and on the gallery walls. These are books printed in traditional Chinese fashion with wooden cases in which they are housed. You go in and you see this sea of writing, and it's quite overwhelming. It looks just like Chinese books that you could find in the library until you get close and try to read. And for those who know Chinese, what you discover is it's nonsense. Every character is invented by Xu Bing. Brilliantly, though, he makes them very, very close to real characters. If it was just a bunch of scribbling, it wouldn't work. But by bringing you to the brink of decipherability, he then creates this kind of frisson when you're suddenly shocked by your inability to read. You can't shut it off. You want to read, and he knows you want to read, and I think this is the power of the word. So what do you get when you do read? What do you discover beyond the beauty of the calligraphy? What's the relationship between text and the way it's embodied graphically? I thought we could look in closing at this very famous scroll from the Princeton University Art Museum. Sometimes it comes to visit the Met every now and then. And it is probably, I think, it's the most important work of calligraphy outside Asia. The calligraphy itself, what it's all about, is just these two lines that are copies of a letter written in the 4th century by the sage of calligraphy Wang Xizhi. And nobody really understands what this letter is about, to tell you the truth. The letter has been passed down, copied, and preserved simply for the beauty of the cursive script writing. The Qianlong emperor wrote an inscription, "Dragon leaping, gate of heaven, tiger crouching, phoenix pavilion." There's the phrase again. You've got to hand it to him. He really had a lot of nerve to put his calligraphy next to that of the greatest artist of all time. He also stamped large seals on the scroll. The scroll passed through the hands of a very great Ming Dynasty artist, critic, and connoisseur, Dong Qichang, who inscribed colophons or commentary after it. He wrote this one, and then a third colophon below. The first two are in small running script, what you might think of as his everyday business hand. And these colophons, these inscriptions, are like catalog essays for an exhibition in which he talks about the history of the scroll, the filiation of the writing, where it had been preserved, and so on. But then you come down to the third colophon, and you've got something very different. This is a kind of poetic effusion about the calligraphy, about that snippet of writing at the top. And it says, "Wherever this scroll is, there must be auspicious clouds hovering over it, even if human eyes can't see them." Now, the in Chinese it doesn't mean ear, it's the same character, but it's a function word, grammatically, that just is like a period, end of the sentence. Notice what he did when he got to the He dragged the tail all the way down the scroll, and it becomes, I think, a visual sigh. Here are the dates of the colophon, 16 something or other, and then, fascinating, Tong Guanzhe. That means the people with whom I'm looking at it, two of his friends, Chen Jiru and a man named Wu Ting, who later owned the scroll, and then Dong Qichang wrote. I think this is fascinating information because it tells us that Dong Qichang wrote this in the presence of these two other eminent connoisseurs. Do you remember the scene earlier when Professor Goldberg was watching someone write? This, too, I believe, was a performance. It was produced inspired by the company of these two men. He exclaims over the wonder of the writing and at the same time performs for his friends. This visual sigh is actually something rather rare in Chinese calligraphy. Generally, there's no direct relationship between the somatic, lexical content of a character and its graphic embodiment. But sometimes things do happen. Here at the Met, a very favorite, beloved scroll by Mi Fu of the Song Dynasty is an inscription about going on a trip on a boat on the Wu River. And Mi Fu talks about the wind rising, and he's going along in his boat, and then the boat gets stuck on a sandbar. And he has to have this big negotiation with the boatmen, and have to pay them extra to get it off the sandbar. And he says that the boatmen began to struggle to get the ship free as if it was a battle. You could see he's writing 3 or 4 characters per line, but when he gets to this word battle, he goes ballistic. And there's a kind of graphic externalization through the writing of the basic meaning of the character. This doesn't happen very often. I think you could imagine why. Too much of this would get to be too much. It could be a little boring. Well, look, the evening is still young, and I urge you to walk to the other end of the museum, go into the galleries, and look, derive pleasure. You have to go slowly. You'll have to come back more than once. But I hope looking at this together will help you see more and get more pleasure from it. Thank you.